In the mid-1970s, Swiss psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross directed a pioneering end-of-life patient care program at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Her work, which would result in definitive publications on the dying process and related perceptions, involved careful clinical observation and interviews documented with scientific rigor. In this context, the case of a 10-year-old girl emerged, a long-term patient whose clarity and description of an unusual experience caught the attention of the entire team. The child, whose name Kübler-Ross decided to protect, had been admitted due to a severe, progressive illness. For weeks, she alternated between moments of weakness and periods of clear consciousness. The multidisciplinary team that cared for her, doctors, nurses, and psychology students, reported that the girl showed an unusual serenity despite her age. In one of the observation sessions, held in a quiet setting in the pediatric ward, the child asked to speak with Dr. Kübler-Ross. The doctor noted in her clinical diary, "She looked at me calmly and said she had seen a very beautiful light, one that didn't hurt her eyes, and that it came from a place where she felt no pain." The account followed a brief cardiac arrest that the medical team successfully reverted. There was no prolonged loss of consciousness or obvious after effects, but when the girl returned, she described details of what she called the place of the light. She said it was like a long tunnel, but without fear, and that, on the other side, there were colors and sounds different from anything she knew. Kübler-Ross, known for her scientific stance and her refusal to interpret such accounts from a religious perspective, neutrally logged every word. Her goal was to understand how the human psyche responds to the proximity of death, and the girl's case provided rare empirical material, a spontaneous description, uninfluenced by beliefs, made by a child not yet exposed to complex spiritual concepts. In the following days, the psychiatrist observed that the patient showed no signs of confusion or delirium. On the contrary, she seemed calmer, slept better, and spoke about the experience with gratitude. When asked what she felt, she simply replied, "I saw a light and I knew everything was all right." The record became part of the studies Kübler-Ross compiled years later on near-death experiences in children, a little explored area at the time. She cited it as an example of the clarity with which the phenomenon could be described, even at an early age and without external influence. This case marked the beginning of a series of observations that would change the way medicine and psychology understood accounts near the boundary between life and its absence. A boundary that, for Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, deserved to be investigated with the same seriousness as any other human process. In the days following the incident, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross maintained direct contact with the girl. Notes show that she did not try to interpret the phenomenon, but to understand its psychological coherence. The tone of the conversations was clinical, without suggestive questions. The psychiatrist only asked what was necessary, what the light looked like, what she felt, and if there were other people in the space she described. The child's answer was precise. She said there was no one there, but the presence felt friendly. She added that it was not like a dream because she was awake and knew the doctors were nearby. This clarity caught Kübler-Ross's attention, who had already heard similar accounts from adults, but rarely from such a young child in full physical recovery. To ensure objectivity, Kübler-Ross asked another professional, a pediatric nurse, to speak with the girl in a separate moment. The report was the same. The child described the tunnel, the intense light, and the feeling of safety. No significant deviation was recorded, and the psychiatrist took the consistency of the report as an indication of psychological authenticity. It was not induced fantasy. At that time, accounts of near-death experiences were still viewed with suspicion by some of the medical community. Many professionals considered them to be hallucinations resulting from cerebral hypoxia. Kübler-Ross, on the other hand, argued that even if there were neurological explanations, the subjective meaning of the account was relevant for understanding how humans deal with the idea of finitude. the case was included in her internal seminars for medical and psychology students at the hospital. During the presentation, she stressed that the girl's behavior after the event showed a reduction in anxiety and an increase in serenity. "She seemed to have understood something about herself," she wrote in a footnote. The child's mother reported in an interview that her daughter had no religious background and had never heard of a light at the end of the tunnel. The family environment was secular, and the girl only attended the neighborhood public school. This absence of external influences reinforced the case's importance to Kübler-Ross as a spontaneous observation. The accounts were archived along with the hospital's clinical records, and the case was cited in Kübler-Ross's lectures and courses on consciousness and the transition between life and the absence of vital functions. She mentioned it not as proof of something beyond life, but as testimony to a human phenomenon that deserved respect and scientific inquiry. The girl's report quickly became a topic of conversation among the hospital professionals. In a time when near-death experiences were barely discussed, the detailed description by a child was surprising for its clarity and calm. Many nurses commented that the patient seemed quieter and even more cooperative with treatments after the incident. Kübler-Ross noted that her attitude toward physical suffering had been transformed. During a weekly clinical briefing, the case was presented to doctors of different specialties. The discussion revolved around the possibility of physiological explanations. A cardiologist suggested that the tunnel sensation could be caused by a momentary lack of oxygen in the brain. A neurologist mentioned the hypothesis of residual cortical activity. Kübler-Ross listened attentively, emphasizing that the main interest was the psychological and human aspect of the experience, not its immediate biological cause. She argued that regardless of the physical origin, the way people interpreted these events could change their relationship with fear and with life. This stance, though controversial, began to influence how students and caregivers approached patients. It was the start of a silent change in hospital practice, the recognition that there were important subjective dimensions in the critical moments of existence. One of the nurses closest to the case reported something that caught Kübler-Ross's attention. She said that when she visited the girl days after the incident, she heard her say a simple phrase, "I know the light will come back, but not now." The nurse interpreted this as a form of hope, not goodbye. Kübler-Ross noted that the child seemed to have developed an intuitive understanding of continuity, a perception beyond the ordinary language of a girl her age. The observations continued for about 3 weeks. During this time, the patient showed a temporary improvement and played normally with the other children in the ward again. Kübler-Ross registered this behavior as signs of emotional stabilization after a borderline experience. It was evidence that the phenomenon did not cause confusion, but, on the contrary, fostered a state of serenity and integration. In subsequent meetings, the psychiatrist used the case as an example to teach clinical empathy. She urged students to observe the patient without judgment, to listen before interpreting. "What we call a mystery may just be something we haven't learned to measure yet," she said in one of her lectures. The girl's case was, therefore, more than just an isolated record. It became part of the foundation that would support Kübler-Ross's humanized view of care and the dying process, a view that would gradually influence hospitals and universities worldwide. In the following weeks, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross continued to monitor the girl with special attention to her emotional balance. The psychiatrist noted that the patient maintained a constant serenity even on days of physical discomfort, rarely complained, and showed empathy for other hospitalized children. She asked if the others had seen the light too, Kübler-Ross wrote in her notes. The team observed that the memory of the experience did not fade with time. Unlike a dream, which often dissolves, the girl reported the episode using the same words, without deviations. For Kübler-Ross, this indicated that the content of the experience had settled in her long-term memory, something unusual after a brief loss of consciousness. The psychiatrist decided to document a recorded interview, a standard procedure in her research. On the audio recording, the child's voice described, "Everything was white, but it didn't hurt. I knew I could stay there, but I also knew I could come back." Kübler-Ross underlined this passage as essential as it revealed the perception of a choice, an element that would be repeated in later accounts from both children and adults. During team meetings, Kübler-Ross stressed that the role of medicine was not to confirm or deny the content of the experience, but to embrace the meaning the patient assigned to it. This principle would later guide the foundations of modern palliative care. "If we listen without fear, the patient articulates what they truly feel," she said. Some professionals, still skeptical, kept their distance from Kübler-Ross's conclusions. One of them wrote in the report, "It is an interesting case, but must be interpreted as a physiological phenomenon." The doctor did not disagree, only adding, "That may be so, but even a physiological phenomenon can change the life of the person who experiences it." This balanced stance, without imposing beliefs, cemented her reputation as an ethical and scientific authority. The girl herself remained under observation until the end of possible clinical treatment. Given the worsening of the disease, Kübler-Ross decided at a certain point to reduce invasive procedures, prioritizing comfort and dignity. The hospital, already under her influence, began to adopt a new protocol of humanized care. In the patient's final days in the hospital, she appeared calm. She spoke little but maintained the same serene tone. A nurse reported hearing her quietly say one afternoon, "The light is coming slowly." Kübler-Ross logged the incident without interpretive comments, only with the observation, "Patient maintains coherence with the original report." These simple and objective notes became part of one of the most cited studies in the psychiatrist's career. Not because of the drama, but because of the clarity with which they demonstrated something essential, the possibility of finding peace amidst uncertainty, even in such a young mind. A few days after the last clinical notes, the girl entered a state of deep sleepiness. The medical team carefully monitored every vital sign, maintaining the priority on comfort and emotional stability. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross remained present at the hospital, observing from afar and instructing the professionals to maintain a calm environment with soft light and no noise. The psychiatrist noted in her diary, "The body seems to be shutting down, but the facial expression preserves serenity. There is no fear." This observation was repeated in many of the cases she studied, reinforcing the idea that emotional peace could arise even in extreme situations when fear seemed to be replaced by a quiet acceptance. After the medical care was concluded, Kübler-Ross compiled all the material from the case, transcriptions, recordings, nursing reports, and observation notes. With the family's permission, the case was included in an internal study collection that the psychiatrist used in seminars on the transition of consciousness. The girl's name was omitted to protect her privacy. During one of her lectures at the University of Chicago, Kübler-Ross cited the case as an example of the need to listen to the patient as a source of knowledge, not just an object of treatment. She argued that experiences like the girl's revealed dimensions of consciousness that neurosciences had not yet understood, but which could provide clues about the functioning of the human mind in border states. The presentation sparked an intense debate. A portion of the audience argued that the descriptions of light and tunnel should be interpreted as predictable physiological reactions. Others, especially psychology students, showed interest in understanding the symbolic and emotional content of these experiences. Kübler-Ross maintained her balanced position. The biological explanation does not negate the human value of the experience. The academic resonance of the case went beyond the hospital. A few years later, researchers from different countries began citing Kübler-Ross's accounts in articles about near-death experiences in children. These studies, inspired by her careful methodology, reinforced the importance of treating the subject with rigor and sensitivity, avoiding religious speculation or scientific dismissal. In Kübler-Ross's personal archives found later, the girl's case was highlighted with a simple annotation: first child to describe the phenomenon with full consciousness and serenity. This phrase summarized not just an isolated episode, but the beginning of a profound shift in how medicine viewed the boundary between life and its absence, not as a taboo, but as a legitimate field of human study. In the months following the conclusion of the case, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross organized her notes and began integrating them into a broader line of research on psychological behavior in the face of death. The girl's report became a turning point. For the first time, a child had clearly described what adults reported in similar experiences, but using simple vocabulary free of religious metaphors. In an internal report from 1976, Kübler-Ross wrote, "The central elements are repeated: light, calm, absence of pain, and a feeling of conscious return. The patient's age does not seem to alter the structure of the experience." This finding led her to believe that the phenomenon might be related to universal mental processes linked to perception and emotional integration in critical situations. The case was presented discreetly at medical conferences, without emotional emphasis. Kübler-Ross knew the topic was sensitive, and any attempt to sensationalize it would harm the research's credibility. Even so, the impact was evident. Many professionals began to rethink the way they talked to terminally ill patients, adopting a more open and empathetic listening approach. One of the psychiatrist's most relevant contributions was demonstrating that anxiety can be reduced when the patient is listened to without interruption. According to the notes, the girl seemed to have found calm precisely because she was free to talk about what she had experienced without being corrected or questioned with disbelief. Kübler-Ross emphasized this aspect as essential for the emotional balance of both the child and the adults around her. In meetings with other psychiatrists, she reported the case as an example of the moment when science only needs to observe, not intervene. This scientific, respectful, and non-judgmental attitude contributed to the consolidation of the field that would later be known as the psychology of death and dying. The girl became a symbol of a new way of thinking in medicine. Her story was recounted at conferences and in articles on compassionate care, without ever revealing her name. Kübler-Ross valued maintaining confidentiality, reminding people that the value of the account lay in its content, not the patient's identity. Decades later, as her books and interviews reached a global audience, the doctor continued to mention the child who saw the light as a personal milestone in her career. For her, this simple case, observed at an ordinary hospital bedside, showed how much humans, even at the age of 10, could face the proximity of death with serenity and clarity when surrounded by respect and a listening ear. Kübler-Ross concluded her lectures on the case with a short sentence recorded in her 1977 notebook: "Peace does not depend on a cure, but on understanding." The case of the girl who described the light at the end of the tunnel continued to be cited by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross throughout her career, particularly in discussions about medical ethics and humanized care. At psychology and psychiatry conventions, she emphasized that the account should not be interpreted as proof of something supernatural, but as a legitimate expression of human consciousness in an extreme state. Towards the end of the 1970s, as Kübler-Ross published her lectures on the 5 stages of dying, this case was again mentioned as an example of the final stage, acceptance. The psychiatrist observed that the girl's behavior showed no denial or anger, replaced by a clear tranquility that was difficult to explain by medical factors alone. Acceptance, even in a child, shows that the psyche has its own mechanisms of balance in the face of the inevitable, she wrote. The study, preserved in the archives of the University of Chicago, became a subject of debate among philosophers and consciousness psychologists. Some saw the report as an indication of altered states of perception. Others, a reflection of childhood neurological plasticity. Kübler-Ross, for her part, insisted on maintaining the ethical focus. The central question is not what happens biologically, but how we listen to what the patient has to say. This stance influenced the creation of more humane hospital protocols, where the emotional dimension was recognized as an integral part of treatment. Nurses and psychologists began to be trained to observe unusual accounts without judgment and to value the positive psychological impact these experiences could have. Among the professionals who followed the case, many reported that it changed their perception of care. One nurse wrote in a later letter to Kübler-Ross, "I learned that the best medicine is sometimes respectful silence." This phrase was later cited by the doctor in one of her lectures on clinical compassion. In 1981, Kübler-Ross participated in a conference in Geneva on death and consciousness. There, she summarized the girl's episode as an example of childlike clarity in the face of the unknown. Without revealing the patient's name, she described how this child had given a lesson in serenity to the adults around her. The audience, composed of doctors and theologians, reacted with respect, not because of the notion of a miracle, but because of the demonstration of humanity in the face of an inevitable limit. For the psychiatrist, the episode remained a reminder that the study of death is not about the end, but about how we live. She noted in her diaries, "This child showed me that light can be a natural metaphor, not for a place, but for a state of consciousness that awakens when fear dissolves." Years later, when Elizabeth Kübler-Ross was already internationally recognized, the girl's case remained one of the few she consistently mentioned. In interviews and at conferences, she referred to it as a lesson in serenity, without ever naming the hospital, the exact date, or the patient's name. Anonymity was part of the clinical respect she always defended. In her later notes, written already in the 1990s, Kübler-Ross revisited the case when discussing the emotional development of children in the face of illness. She observed that unlike adults, little ones did not carry the same accumulation of beliefs or denials, and therefore described their experiences directly. "Children speak with clarity because they have not yet learned to be afraid of what they don't understand," she wrote. The original recording of the interview with the girl, preserved in the archives of the Kübler-Ross Foundation, continued to be consulted by researchers interested in understanding the nature of pediatric near-death experiences. The recording, short, with a soft and calm voice, reveals the child's serene tone, without extreme emotion or mental confusion. Kübler-Ross emphasized that this detail made the report especially valuable. It did not stem from fear, but from a clear observation. In the final years of her life, the psychiatrist returned to the topic with a more reflective outlook. In a speech in California in 2000, she said, "What I learned from children is that the end is not the end for them. It's just a change of form." Although her words were interpreted in various ways, the audience knew she was referring to cases like the girl who saw the light, experiences that, even without a definitive explanation, revealed an essential trait of human nature, the natural impulse to understand and move on. Kübler-Ross's scientific legacy solidified precisely through this stance of balance between reason and empathy. She did not seek to prove or deny anything beyond clinical observation. Her commitment was to listening and respect for the human narrative, whatever it might be. That is why the 10-year-old girl's case transcended boundaries. It became an example of how science can dialogue with mystery without losing its seriousness. Decades later, students of medicine and psychology continue to analyze this report as a milestone in the transition from the traditional medical model to the humanistic approach of palliative care. In lectures and seminars, the story is retold as part of the origin of an ethic based not on certainties, but on attention and presence. In the words of Kübler-Ross, recorded in one of her last interviews, "I don't know what exists after the light, and maybe that's not important. What's important is that someone saw it and felt peace." And that testimony, coming from a child, is enough to remind us of the value of the life we have now.